And the name of this book is Vienna, Prelude. It is by Bodie, Thoene, Thoene. And this is the prologue. London, February 23rd, 1972. It was a tiny shop, tucked discreetly in among the other shops along London's Oxford Street. The first morning, even with the address written precisely on the slip of paper in her hand, Ernestine had almost walked right past it. That was a common mistake, they had told her later. Generations of musicians had been marching right past the door of Holt and Sons and then back again. Eventually, it seemed all the finest string players found the entrance, just as the finest stringed instruments in the world somehow managed to turn up here. Names like Stradivarius, Amati, and Guarnerius were matched with hopeful violinists whose names were much less known than the names of the instruments they hoped to play and purchase here. "It is our goal," the old elder Holt had said with a slight dignified bow, "to match the finest string instruments in the world with musicians who might do them honor for yet another lifetime of their existence." Unfortunately for Ernestine, such cherished instruments were far beyond her financial means. She was a student now at the Mozarteum in Salzburg. The cost of her schooling alone had required sacrifice for her family in New York. Her talent was exceptional. No one could deny that, but mere talent alone was not enough to match her with one of those cherished instruments now tucked away in the vaults of the shop. She had not dared to hope for that. She had not dared to even ask to see the creations from the great violin makers. There was no use deliberately tormenting herself with something she could never possess. She had traveled here with a goal in mind, to trade her old violin for something that was smaller and more suited to her hands. Quite simply, her teacher had told her a dozen times, her violin was too large for her. So she had written to Holt's of London and had come here to the shop with money she could hardly afford. Now, 3 days later, she sat forlornly in Holt's tiny walnut-paneled practice room, ringed by a half-dozen instruments. They fit her hands. They fit her meager budget. But each violin was mediocre in tone and quality, and would remain so no matter who played them. Of course, the Holt family knew this as well. The finest instruments could find 100 voices in the hands of a master musician. That could not be said for the violins that Ernestine had played in hour after hour from the opening of the shop until its closing. The disappointment in her eyes had begun to show in the eyes of the Holt family as well. It was obvious that she was capable of more, deserving of more. It was nearly 3:30 in the afternoon when Ernestine replaced the last of the available violins in its case. There were no more instruments within the price range for her to try. Her trip to London had been a waste of time and money. She wrestled down her unhappiness and sat back in her chair for the first time in hours. Her neck and shoulders ached. She had not noticed the pain until now that she was finished. A soft knock sounded on the door. The youngest of the sons poked his head into the room. His brow was wrinkled with concern and sympathy. He knew before she told him. "Not quite right, eh?" he asked apologetically. She smiled slightly and shook her head, spreading her empty hands toward the violins on the table beside her. "They're all very nice," she began, "but you must not be too terribly disappointed." He glanced toward the instruments. "Violins come and go every day around here, you know. Every day. Sometimes it takes months. Ernestine, violinists have been known to take months making such an important decision. You've been here only 3 days, after all." He was trying so hard to be cheerful and encouraging, but it was obvious that he knew how she felt. He had been the first to read her letter from Salzburg. He knew her financial limitations, and for 3 days the family had heard the intensity of her music. It was rare that a young musician with such talent came along, even more rare than the appearance of the finest instruments. What this beautiful young woman needed in her hands was far beyond her reach, for now at any rate. She lifted her chin slightly. "Yes, maybe another time." She clenched and unclenched her hands. "You have all been terrific," she said in her American twang. "Really great." "It has been our pleasure, believe me." The young pushed his wire-rimmed glasses onto his nose. He bowed slightly, and Ernestine thought how much like his father he seemed in mannerisms and looks. "We have had the very great pleasure of hearing you play these last few days, and someday perhaps you will be back, and—" He turned as his father entered the cubicle. The elder Mr. Holt stood half concealed by the door. His face showed none of the disappointment of his son. "No luck, Ernestine?" His face was slightly flushed as he glanced toward the unwanted instruments. "Well, I thought we might have a bit of a problem when I first heard you play. Quite a gift you have, and I quite expect to hear you playing on the BBC one day soon." His compliments did little to cheer her up, but she stood and extended her hand. Thanks, you've been so helpful, and Not helpful enough, I'm afraid," he nodded toward the violins. "I had thought we might have a bit of a problem," he said again. "Will you write me?" She bit her lip and frowned as the realization that she was going back empty-handed sank in. "If something comes in, you have my address at the Mozarteum." The elder gentleman clucked his tongue sadly. "I doubt that we will ever find what you're looking for, Ernestine. Something that sounds like a Stradivarius with a price like these." She felt apologetic. Had she been too particular? "Oh, I mean, if something turns up like—" She could not think what might turn up that she could afford. She flushed with embarrassment. She had come expecting the impossible. The elder Holt tugged at his vest and stepped around his son. He carried a battered violin case in his hand. "Perhaps like this." He finished the sentence for her, then placed the case on her chair and opened it. Inside was a delicate instrument with an almost golden color. His son crossed his arms and nodded approvingly. "Yes, here is one you might try, Ernestine. Good idea, Father." Ernestine frowned and stared at the instrument for a moment. Her head was throbbing now, and she was certain that trying this one last violin would make no difference. They had as much as said that she could never find what she wanted, what she could afford. Sensing her reluctance, the elder man bowed slightly and took the instrument from the case. "One last try, Ernestine," he urged gently. She took the violin from him with a weary smile. After all, they were trying so hard to help her. "One more, then." This time, they did not leave her alone in the practice room as she raised her bow to the strings and began to play. Warm and rich, the music of Mozart filled the room and flowed into the hallway, drawing others from the shop toward the cubicle. Here was the voice she had been hoping for, notes so clear and full. After a few moments, tears filled her eyes. She stopped and lowered the bow. This was no ordinary violin they had brought to her. She started to look into the instrument to see the maker's label. "No," Mr. Holt put his hand out. "There's no need for you to know until we finish talking." She was filled with frustration. Why had they done this to her? Why had they allowed her to play what could never be her own? The agony must have been evident in her eyes as she stood in the center of the room and cradled the violin in her hands. "This is not like the others," she whispered in an almost inaudible voice. "You know I can't." "Sit down," Mr. Holt instructed. "You're quite right," he said. "I had not realized how extraordinary it was until you played it." His son had said nothing until now. "We've had it 2 weeks, but we were uncertain," he began to explain, then looked at his father for help. "Well, you see, it has no history. It is a very unusual instrument. Someone found it just last year, tucked away in an attic in an old house, in Eastern Europe." "Eastern Europe?" Ernestine asked. Occasionally she knew fine instruments found their way out of communist countries, but it was a rare occurrence and extremely dangerous for whoever carried them into the West. "Such instruments have a way of finding their way to shops such as our own on occasion. Many are forgeries, of course, copies of Strauss, or perhaps," the young man looked at his father, "perhaps copies of the work of someone like Andrew Guarnierius." He shrugged. Ernestine looked down at the golden-hued violin in her hands. Guarnierius? The master had created his violins with the skill of Stradivarius in the late 1600s. Some violinists preferred his instruments above any others. Had she just played a Guarnierius violin? What kind of cruel joke were they playing? She blinked up at the two men. "This is not a copy," she said simply. The two nodded in unison. "That is our opinion," said the elder man. "But its history is a complete mystery. It has no provenance. We can find no proof, no records. It was discovered in an attic by a young chap who brought it over the wall with him. Oh yes, the label quite clearly. Andrea Guarnierius, Cremona, 1674. She resisted the urge to peer into the F-hole to see the label. She did not dare look at the violin. It was the work of the master. It had survived 300 years, and now she held it after so many others. She had caused it to sing as 3 centuries of musicians had done before her. "Why have you let me play it?" she asked, feeling that she did not want to let go of it. "You know there is no way that I can—" The elder Holt interrupted her. "It is our goal," he said solemnly, "to match the finest string instruments in the world with musicians who might do them honor for yet another lifetime of their existence." He bowed and smiled. "Apart from the voice it has in your hands, we have no proof that it is anything more than a mere copy. It is simply a mystery to us and must be priced accordingly." Night Music, 1936. think I'm going to stop here. Until next time. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up His countenance upon you and grant you His peace.